Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight, in an unusual MFV change of schedule, we decided not to do Legion because we both went to see A Quiet Place off the back of the amazing reviews, and we decided that, whereas we've done Legion possibly twice, at least once, but probably twice before, we thought we might have more new and exciting things to say about this new and successful film. So we are covering A Quiet Place, and as our supplementary question, we're doing how much do plot nitpicks actually matter, for reasons that may become clear over the course of our Quiet Place review. And yep, we'll get to all that in a second, but first, Alistair, what else have you been experiencing this fortnight?
Well, I've been watching a new BBC drama, which is their adaptation of The City and the City, based on the novel by China Miéville.
Is it good? You've read the book, haven't you?
Yes, I've read the book, and yeah, I like the TV adaptation. Yeah, it's a good adaptation of it. Understandably, it loses some of the ambiguity that the book has, because ambiguity works so well in a novel, and translating that onto screen when you have to be more specific. Some of the ambiguity is lost, but they've done their best. For those who don't know, just briefly, the premise of The City and the City is that there are two cities, Bajel and Olcoma, and they sort of occupy the same physical space but are separate from each other. And you're not allowed to see or acknowledge one when you're in the other. And they do a really good job of explaining how this works, how you could be sat in a cafe and across the road could be a bar that's in another city and you're not even supposed to acknowledge its existence or pretend it's not there. The book is quite good about sort of conveying this and giving you sort of a vague sense of what it's like without kind of any details that would make you think, yeah, that's implausible or would ruin it.
Yeah.
The TV show necessarily has to show you kind of like how does it work a bit more, but they do it quite cleverly by there's like very different colour schemes. Like Bajel is very yellow and green, Olcoma is sort of very blue and grey. So they do different colour schemes and like sort of interesting blur effects, on sort of parts of the screen. And they've chosen the locations very well in that Bajel looks like very, very Eastern European. The location they chose for Olcoma look they're very modern. It's all sort of glass skyscrapers and sort of concrete buildings. So they've done a very good job.
So it's a good adaptation then. It passes whatever litmus test you have for these things.
Yeah. No, I'd recommend it. Yeah, if you've not read the books, a book singular.
If you've not read a book.
Yeah, if you've not read a book, then maybe start by reading a book. But if you've not read this book but are intrigued, it's worth watching. It's got David Morrissey in it as the main character, and he's very good. If you have read the books and really like them, I'd say it's a good adaptation. It's not a patch from the book, but adaptations really are. Yeah, it's only got a few things like this. Quite clunky voiceover they've added just to sort of explain everything. I don't know, it's just the way these things go in like TV shows, but it gets the thumbs up from this China Miéville fan.
Yeah, because Miéville is a weird fiction writer, isn't he? That's what he's mainly known for. So I guess this must be one of the comparatively less surreal Miéville books to adapt.
Yeah, it's one of his most accessible books. And if you've not read any of his books, this is actually a really good one to start with. It's much shorter than the others. He's written some amazing sort of fantasy novels like Perdido Street Station and The Scar, which are great books, but they're long and difficult books to get into. So if you want to start with his work, The City and the City is a good place because the whole plot is a sort of murder mystery that has threads of the investigation in both of the two cities. So it's got a kind of murder thriller plot at its core, and it's got a good concept. So yeah, I'd recommend it.
Yeah, I do have it on the Kindle, waiting to be got to. It may actually be one of my next two books. We'll see how it goes.
Cool. So Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, because I keep my commitments, I've been watching the thing we said we were going to watch. I've watched Legion, the start of the second season. Yeah, so far it's pretty good. It's good in roughly the same way the first season was, which, to be honest, is one of the reasons I was okay with not doing, like, a full-length review of it. But yeah, it's got the same sort of interesting, surreal perspective on this sort of adventure show. It makes a storyline that I have seen 100 times in 100 other of the superhero TV shows I watch seem fresh again, just on execution alone. Which, to be honest, is something we'll probably be coming back to in the Quiet Place review. But yeah, it's still really good. It's still really got its unique voice. It still feels very X-Men-y, but it's doing something that the other X-Men adaptations have, for the most part, shied away from, which is the sort of trying to make the surreal telepathy stuff actually work. And it actually somehow succeeds.
Yeah, what I really like about the show is it's got a very sort of distinct sort of visual style. The whole way everything's done is sort of slightly abstract, slightly surreal sort of way. It means it is like very, very distinctive. You couldn't be confused that you were watching a different show. Whereas a lot of shows, there's a kind of this sort of TV superhero thriller look that they kind of go for, whereas Legion is It's got sort of its own personality. And also like the production design is very 1960s, like all the fashion, like the hair and like the design of the buildings is like really 1960s, but it's clearly set in the future because of the technology, which means the whole thing seems weirdly timeless. Which I like.
Yeah, it feels like the look... I mean, I'm not enough of a student of different eras to actually fully pin this down, but it feels like the look has moved on slightly from between seasons 1 and 2, because the point is that there's been kind of a time jump. Like, David disappears at the end of season 1. David, the main character, aka Legion. I'm not sure he's called that very much, or possibly at all in the show. But yeah, he disappears at the end of season 1, comes back, and things have changed slightly. And it feels like the look has slightly moved on. Things are a bit less sort of bright and happy party 60s than they sometimes were in season 1.
Yeah, it's definitely darker, like physically, I guess, and also tonally. So that's interesting as well, yeah. And I'm intrigued to see where the plot of the series goes. I mean, I think they've done it well by starting out strong with there's a mystery, like, oh, where did his year of his life go? What happened?
And they've sort of found a slightly different twist on the what's up with David. Can you actually trust him? Is he actually reliable? Can he actually be trusted to know himself what he's actually doing? The sort of layers of how other people can actually deal with David are still there, and they've sort of found ways to actually make it more complicated, which is impressive because it was quite complicated already.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's looking good. I'm hoping this will be less of the, again, disappointing second album than Jessica Jones was. I'm hoping this will be, a strong second album that keeps up with and improves on the things I liked about the first one.
Yeah, I'm hoping very much for the same.
Okay, and yeah, that, folks, in like 2 minutes was the episode you were going to get.
So, as a bonus, should we do another episode or should we just go home now?
Yeah, well, that was our review of Legion. Our question is, shall we do something else? The answer is yes. And now it's time for MFV 62. I'm not actually going to do that. That would destroy my desire for consistent numbering.
First up this episode, we will be reviewing A Quiet Place, starring Emily Blunt and John Krasinski. Set in a post-apocalyptic world where humans have been wiped out by armoured monsters with very sensitive hearing that attack the slightest sound, a family try to survive by being very, very quiet. We've been to see this recently. Nick, what did you think of it? He's already dead.
I just did my review in sign language, did you not get it? So yeah, this was really good. It's another one of these films we seem to be getting increasingly excited by recently. Self-contained, relatively short, a bit sort of short story-esque in that it just takes pretty much a single premise, works it over thoroughly, and then moves on. I don't know if it's the sort of the era of the overstuffed, overplotted, overlong blockbuster that has made us feel this way, who knows. But A Quiet Place, it does that thing that we all like. It's an addition of a largely quite familiar story with enough of a twist thrown on it to make it seem new and different. In this case, yeah, there's the family in the house, in this sort of post-apocalyptic, or at least somewhat dystopian setting, dealing with these monsters who basically kill you if you make a noise. And that's the basic premise. So if you make a noise, the thing will come out of it nowhere and just slash you apart, because it's basically a massive evil, I don't know, what if a bat fucked a praying mantis or something? A sort of massive evil bat with lots of sharp edges that comes out of nowhere and kills you if you make a single sound. Yeah, basically the film is largely silent. No one really speaks except in a couple of specific bits where the plot bends around to allow it. And this family have survived largely because their daughter is deaf and therefore they all know sign language, so they've been able to adapt quicker than, I'm guessing, the non-signing people to this world where they just can't speak at all. And yeah, it works really well. By leaning on the tropey stuff to get the obvious basics across, you get the silence angle in, but it works as both a cool horror gimmick and, it's a nice bit for the idea of what it's like to be deaf and the experience of other people dealing with deafness and the difference between the people who are having to be quiet because otherwise they'll die and the one character who actually is deaf. It does some interesting things with that on top of the sort of monster house family hut stuff. So yeah, it's good fun. It's a good film.
Yeah, I think there's a good sort of encapsulation of the whole film.
Job done.
The brilliance of it is a very, very simple premise. One of the things I was thinking as I watched it is like, I can't believe no one's come up with this idea before. It's just like, it's very simple. Right? You've got to be quiet. Let's go there. And even the slightest sound, like, a kid reaching for something on a shelf and then it nearly falls to the floor or accidentally knocking over a lamp is like incredibly tense. And obviously a film with long, prolonged silences in it really does build tension, especially as it very early on establishes pretty much exactly what will happen if you make a noise. It's very clear, so a sort of weird, armoured praying mantis thing will come running out of the woods and chop you to bits. It's been established exactly what's going to happen. It's never far from your mind that the slightest noise results in pretty much instantaneous death. So the tension is kind of sustained quite neatly throughout. I mean, it's quite a short film, at least certainly by modern blockbuster standards, 90 minutes. So I think it's very well paced and very well put together so that it doesn't stretch the tension too far, but does also get some nice, interesting set pieces out of this concept. Most noticeably, one of the main plot lines is that the mother of the family, played by Emily Blunt, is pregnant. So there's a whole thing like, well, how are you going to give birth in silence and then deal with a newborn baby that is crying will attract murderous praying mantises? So yeah, it's almost as if the writers sat down and said, like, what is the loudest thing we can possibly think of to put in a world where you have to be quiet all the time?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of the interesting things about this are the systems they've put in place to deal with the need to be quiet all the time. Like, well, with the pregnancy, they've got this terrifying system where they're going to give it a little baby-sized oxygen mask and then put it in a soundproof box. It's like, well, I mean, the plus side, the human race will continue. The downside is they're all going to be quite severely mentally ill.
Yeah.
Or possibly like a whole race of serial killers, because that sounds incredibly traumatic. But, at least it won't die in a bloody mess killed by a gigantic praying mantis bat. So, that's nice. And the more general stuff like, the fact that they don't wear shoes because they make too much noise, the fact that the father lays down this trail of sort of sand between the doorway and everywhere he needs to go outside to avoid making noise by walking on the ground, and the way they clearly do everything you would just casually run through or do quickly, incredibly slowly and carefully to avoid like dropping an object or putting an object down too forcefully. It is in some ways quite a slow film, I mean, it's weird, it's both a slow film and it's over quite quickly, because I think the creators are aware that, this would maybe get a bit punishing if you've watched it over the course of 2 solid hours of people not speaking, putting objects down very slowly.
Yeah.
It's very well paced, it very much does its thing, makes its points, picks the demonstrations of those points for the most punchy and succinct and good, and then just gets out. So yeah, the silence as a whole is very nicely managed.
Yeah, and there's loads of like really clever bits to make you think, like the fact they have to hand wash all their clothes because you couldn't even use, aside from the fact there doesn't seem to be like much electricity, you couldn't even use a mangle without making noise. Or the only thing they can eat really is, well, they eat vegetables that they grow, but also the sort of main source of protein is fish, because you can smoke fish, and obviously they can't light a fire really. That's going to make sound and attract these creatures. So you can smoke fish, which is quiet. So they've really spent a lot of time thinking about like how would you practically go about living as best as you could in sort of total silence, like I say, and by doing everything slowly. And yeah, but small things like a loose nail on the flight of stairs.
That was very classic horror film though, wasn't it? There's a bit where they knock a nail so it ends up sticking straight out of the stairs, and then you just look at it thinking, okay, when's someone going to stamp on that at the worst possible moment?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the other good thing about it, I guess, the fact that it's just outside of this silence gimmick that's baked into the whole thing. It's actually very traditional. It's a very straight up sort of horror thriller adventure, hide from the scary monster type film.
It sets up things well and then pays them off well. Like, as soon as I saw the loose nail come out, I was like, it's Chekhov's nail. That'll be back.
It's always Chekhov for something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think when Chekhov wrote all his short stories and lived his life and produced his artistic work, he thought that the single biggest thing he'd be famous for in the future was having his name attached to anything that had any significance?
Well, it's a lasting legacy.
At least it makes it clear that he's important.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, I think the whole thing, the genius of the whole thing is the simplicity, as you said. Like it is very much like a sort of short story sort of esque concept. Yeah, and I think you're right that it shows that long, overly complicated, convoluted plots don't necessarily work so well in films. Like I always thought that books are actually quite a poor source of stories to adapt into films, unless it's either a book with like it's very simple and filled with a lot of like sort of flowery description that you can get through quite faster visually, or it's a book they basically going to chop a lot of it out and focus down, whereas like a lot of great films have these more short story alike, and that there's kind of quite a simple premise.
Well, yeah, as I say, the fact that a lot of it's quite simple means the fact that it's silence obviously isn't that much of a barrier to understanding. Like the characters, I think it does a good job of distinguishing how the characters are and how they speak and how they interact with each other and giving them distinct personalities. They're, to be honest, in some ways quite generic personalities. Like the dad is the sort of hard guy for survival. The mother is slightly warmer and more nurturing. One of the kids is a little bit more angst-ridden about the role she may or may not have played in the death at the beginning of the film, and the other kid is a bit younger and a bit more just trying to get by. And yeah, they're not, massively nuanced characters, and the film doesn't really take the time to really dig under the surface of them. But, in a a film this short, where communication has to be laboured through sort of a slower method, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Everything that's in this film is there to the extent it needs to be, so you can mostly enjoy the sort of the tension of the monster and be impressed by all the silent stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, the film is, I think, very, very good at conveying its meaning very, very quickly and easily. Like, only after a few minutes, you've basically got all the information you need to know to understand exactly this world. And it's done very efficiently. Like, there's just sort of a shot of a room covered in newspapers quite early on, and the newspaper headlines, get across the fact that the whole world has been destroyed by some monsters and you have to be quiet. That's the only way you can survive. They get across the relationship of the family quite quickly. Their oldest daughter is deaf, and they kind of get across the family relations quite quickly. And as you say, they're not doing anything original with there's the gruff, tough dad who's kind of keeping them alive, and there's the slightly more nurturing mum. But you could say it's like stereotypical, or it's fairly generic. The way I would put it more is it's iconic, and obviously very much cinema is based on a language of iconography, in that you see a sign or an icon of something and you recognise that as what it is, which is, it's a difficult concept to get your head around. For example, if you see in a film a man wearing a policeman's uniform, you know that's a policeman. That's not someone who isn't a policeman dressed as a policeman, unless the film has to make it very clear that's what's going on. Because the way we understand, films is that if loads of people run into a scene dressed as policemen, then they're the cops. They're not like some kind of surprise police-themed party that's turned up. And obviously a lot of shows or films play around with this and use it you can Arrested Development turns that beat into a joke, which is that they have like a running thing of strippers dressed as cops. So people run in, you think it's the cops, because that's how the language of cinema and television works. And obviously it turns out they're strippers dressed as cops. So you can make jokes out of that. The way this relates back to A Quiet Place is that what you have here is, again, like an iconic family. You see these characters and you instantly recognise and understand who they are and what their relationship is. And because this film is very straightforward and relies on very little dialogue, certainly very little spoken dialogue, you need to use the iconographic language of cinema in your favour in order to establish this premise very quickly and then move quickly to the plot to keep the tension up. And that's one of the strengths of this film.
Yeah, I do agree with everything you've just said, especially, in a film where, as I've already said, they're communicating quite slowly and quite very much through images and through just letting you assume a lot of stuff. Yes, just be able to go, right, this is that, you know what this is, let's move on to the other thing, is important. Although, this is something they said in the Seriously review on the Seriously podcast, and I do kind of agree that the actual dialogue when it happens is kind of hammy, or at least kind of really a bit punishingly generic. Family under stress having emotional conversation on American television. Like, there's a bit where the mother says to the father, we just have to protect them. What's our life worth if we can't protect them? Or something synonymous with that. Yeah, I don't know. It's one of these bits where the entire conversation just always jumps straight to that sort of thing, and it just seems a bit... Surely you could have worked this dialogue for a few more meetings, so it seems a bit less really generic. I mean, considering it sort of really gets called directly to attention, considering that there are only like 2 spoken conversations in the film, I think. It's weird. The bits where they're speaking in sign, the conversations that are subtitled, were actually quite nicely played and felt weirdly natural, whereas when they start speaking out loud, it seems quite stiff. And I suppose if you're crediting them with a certain amount of meta-cleverness, maybe that's deliberate. Maybe the sign is the casual language, and therefore when they speak out loud, it is only for these heightened moments of melodramatic emotion. But it did seem very melodramatic.
Yeah, I think you're right that there was a lot of soap opera type dialogue in that, cut straight to the kind of emotional punch. And yeah, maybe you could do things saying that, like, maybe that if they're used to communicating through sign, they can only express themselves crudely via talking, especially if you're a child that's really only spend your entire life communicating via sign and isn't used to talking. And also there's something about the film that the emotional story behind the film is a very simple one. So it's kind of got simple dialogue to underline it. In terms of like the levels of conflict, the big conflict of it in this film is extra-personal or environmental conflict, and that pretty much the entire film is about people trying to survive in a hostile world. The internal struggles within the characters or the relationships between them is very much secondary and is stripped back to be as efficient as possible and keep the tension high. But you're right. There's no reason why they couldn't have maybe workshopped some of the dialogue a little bit more to make it slightly, less TV soap opera.
Yeah, I mean, there's so little of it. I was sufficiently invested in the characters, but I was willing to allow them to, eat a bit of ham. It's not as if they weren't, well, at least one of those 2 conversations, it's not as if they weren't under quite a lot of stress at the time. You can understand how they might jump a bit to the melodrama. But, there we go.
Yeah.
And yeah, I did actually quite like all the actual characters and all the actors playing them. I mean, John Krasinski, it's interesting to see him jump to intense movie star status, as I mostly remember him likably playing Jim from The Office. But he seems to pull it off, and obviously he directed and co-wrote this film, I think. So, this seems to be a bit of a triumph for him. It's done really well. So, yeah, if nothing else, this does seem to be John Krasinski finally moving firmly into his post-office career, so good for him. He seems like a likeable dude when I see him acting on television.
I think Emily Blunt is his wife in real life.
She is his real wife, yes. I only know this because, again, they mentioned it on Seriously, but yes.
It's interesting because sometimes you think that, you give an actor a chance to write, direct, star in their own movie, you might think, well, this could be a bit self-indulgent. Mel Gibson makes Braveheart, basically, so he can save all of Scotland. But they've managed to come up with what is quite a simple, sort of straightforward, not very indulgent idea, and it's one of those films that I'm glad it's got such attention, because it could be one of those kind of that's a really good, well-made film that sort of disappears into the, it gets forgotten. I mean, I don't want to say it's this year's Get Out, because this year may not even have a Get Out to sort of...
I don't think it's quite as intense and, in your face, makes you think as Get Out. But yeah, I mean, it could well be this year's big cult horror film.
Or a sort of breakout indie film. And it's nice to see that everyone's talking about a film.
How indie can a film be when it's co-produced by Michael Bay?
That is a valid point. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to say, where does the line between indie stop and mainstream begin?
At this point, anything that isn't a 12A moderate fantasy violence film is basically indie.
Yeah. That's pretty much it. Yeah, I guess that will work with that as a working definition. I mean, yeah, it's...
we shouldn't, because I was being sarcastic and it's bollocks, but okay.
Yeah, no, but I haven't seen posters or really much advertising for it. We saw a very, very short trailer for it before when we went to see The Shape of Water, and it actually was a great trailer, about 30 seconds of footage. I'll say, oh, that was intriguing.
I've seen adverts on 4OD for it, I think, but I'm watching my Brooklyn Nine-Nine and my Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Okay, well, and maybe it's got a bit more advertising than I was aware. Don't really watch 4OD, at least since Dairy Girls finished. But it's nice to see a film, I think, that a lot of its success is driven by word of mouth, and the word of mouth is, this is good, go see it. It's always nice when that happens. Quality wins out better than throwing millions of pounds at putting posters on the side of buses.
Yeah, it does seem to be one of the first sort of buzzy, this wasn't expected to be big, but has become big films of 2018, which, whether it's indie or not, is always fun when it happens. Right, okay, I have one more note, and I was going to leave it to the end because it's the one that contains a massive spoiler, so...
Yeah, this is the point when we should say to the listeners, if you haven't seen this film and are really intrigued by it, and we would certainly recommend go seeing it, maybe switch off now so we don't ruin it for you, because I saw this film knowing as little about it as possible, and I think that is the best way to see it. So if you've not seen it and want to, now is the chance to stop or skip ahead. Obviously, if you have seen it or don't care about spoilers, stick with us.
I mean, in fairness to the listeners, we have already described several plot elements, but this is me flat out describing, or at least heavily implying, what happens in the ending, so I'm going to go ahead and say this is a proper ruinous spoiler. It's a bit of a nitpick. This is why we're talking about nitpicks in a minute. If you want to cut straight to the nitpicks discussion, I'm going to attempt to conduct that without saying what the Quiet Place nitpick actually was. So, yes, but for the next few minutes, I will be nitpicking the ending of The Quiet Place. If you don't want to hear me do that because you don't want the spoiler or because you think it just sounds annoying, then feel free to cut ahead to the question. The timestamp is in the description. I think that's enough spoiler warning. Okay, ready? Go. Cool. Okay, so the ending, we did have a conversation about this on the way out of the cinema, but the ending beat did slightly trigger my suspension of disbelief. It basically ends with the family working out a way to kill the monsters involving white noise. I don't particularly need to describe exactly how it happens, but did the scientists of the world not figure this out before it descended into dystopia? I mean, I know that there are ways in which it could have happened, in which the whole world was taken out at once, in which these monsters just appeared everywhere, but it just seemed a bit weird that this was only come up with in this one place at this one time. The film was meant to take place, 450 days, a year and a half, nearly, after these things appear.
Yeah.
Are these people meant to be the last people left alive in the world? I suppose it could make sense if they were the last people left alive in the world. I don't really know. I mean, to be fair, it's one of these things which you could write around the world building, but they did so little world building that it just seemed a bit weird. It felt like they weren't writing the entire world was falling apart. They were just writing things that were very, very, very shit.
There's a plot line when the father is trying basically various radio frequencies and broadcasting SOS in Morse code. And you can see there's a list of various international frequencies or wavelengths, and he's kind of trying them all. And he's kind of crossed a lot of them out, which I don't know if that's supposed to imply that there is no one else out there.
Well, the entire world has actually gone apart from these 4 quiet people in this hut.
Well, it is left to your own imagination, I guess. One way I think to interpret it is that, yeah, they're probably not the only people in the world who found out that ultrasound, or a specific frequency of ultrasound, is a weapon you can use against the creatures, but they may be the only sort of individual family left to just wander and survive by themselves. So it's possible that somewhere out there in the world there is this kind of enclave of probably the rich and powerful and military officials who hide behind a wall of speakers broadcasting the sound and live in this kind of bizarre, randy and probably quite totalitarian survivalist society. I mean, so maybe
That's a good
actually...
point. Maybe this is all build up for The Quiet Place 2. It's much less uplifting.
Yeah, I think one way of looking at it is if you read M.R. Carey's novels, The Girl of All the Gifts or The Boy on the Bridge. That's a post-apocalyptic zombie future. In that, there's a place called Beacon, which is, the one place where the army and some formal government in Britain survives because, only about 99.9% of the human race is wiped out. Obviously, some people get together, usually again supported by government power, wealth and military hardware to survive, and they form a totalitarian, militaristic society that's actually oppressive, and you wouldn't want to live in Beacon, even though, you're safe from the zombies. But out there in the wilderness, there are small groups of people who have found ways to eke out a small existence despite the presence of zombies. So, maybe there is a beacon somewhere in The Quiet Place, behind, like I say, some kind of military sound system thing, but obviously it's probably quite an awful place to live because all the social structures have broken down. Maybe, but the great thing about the film is it kind of leaves you all to wonder that, and it doesn't give you a hint either way. I mean, the one thing I really don't want from The Quiet Place is people to think that was good. We should do a sequel when we explore the world a bit more and find out more about it. It's like no, just, that was good. Leave it at that.
Yeah, the worst part is the sequel is probably now coming, but maybe John Krasinski will walk away with his artistic integrity intact. Anyway, I don't know. It's one of these things that just sort of dinged my bell on the way past and made me think, does that make sense? But again, the film is focused on being lean, so even if it does actually know how it makes sense, I guess it doesn't really want to have to pause the film to do the 5 minutes of exposition necessary to explain to me why this makes sense. So, fair enough. It's probably not a film ruining problem. I mean, ultimately, you need the dystopia aspect to do all the cool silent society beats they want to do. Like, you couldn't have just had a normal family and then this thing appears, because then you couldn't do all this cool stuff about how they've changed their life to be based around silence. So that's, ultimately it's to do the film they wanted to do, you need that. You can just about work it past, so whatever. Stop whining, Nick, here's your film.
The other thing is that, obviously when they're writing the film, it's like, well, we need an ending, and there's only really 2 ways it can end. Either one, they come up with some way to kind of improve their situation by surviving, which is what happens, or B, they could just go for the depressing ending, which is they all end up dead.
All of them end up dead, or several of them end up dead, and the house is demolished and the family just walk off sadly into the distance.
Yeah, so they went with happy ending, and obviously there is a little bit of, I mean, it's not quite Doctor Who level of, I scienced it right at the end and now it's all sorted. But it is somewhere on the spectrum of, we've done a thing with a gizmo and now things are better.
It's not a completely out of nowhere thing. I mean, that is, I guess, as you said on the way out of the cinema, probably how you'd kill such a creature, or at least something akin to that, or at least how you'd attack or discomfort such a creature.
Yeah, our friend we went to see the film with said that, they're basically teenagers in city centres, aren't they? Just need to play high-frequency sounds that only they can hear and then they leave.
Or just put some classical music on outside the station until they get angry and disperse.
Yeah.
There we go. We solved that. It's fine. It's okay to like A Quiet Place again, guys.
Next up, this episode, we will be discussing, do plot nitpicks really matter? A Quiet Place is a very tight film, but as we pointed out, there are some holes in the plot. Is any film or TV show perfect? Does it matter that you can pick holes in the plot? Nick, any thoughts?
I think the actual answer I've probably concluded is something like it depends on how much accumulated goodwill you've got towards the film. I mean, I think there is something to the niggle I just raised in A Quiet Place, which, as promised, I will not be describing again in any detail. But it didn't ruin the film for me because I was on board with the characters and the feel of it, and they did a lot of interesting, clever things. I mean, I think this is something I've vaguely said before in reference to other things. Once you fall out of love with a thing, or indeed a person. Oh. the spell is broken and everything they do starts to annoy you. But if you still love something, you let it go. And, so it is here. I mean, there are plenty of things I like. I have specific examples, I'll get to them, which definitely have valid nitpicks to them. But, I let it go. Whereas, I could deliver a raft of nitpicks about things I don't like, and I would act as if they actually matter. Because that's how people, particularly it has to be said, nerdy people arguing on the internet, go about their business.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Yeah, depends on the collective goodwill. And obviously you have an emotional relationship with a piece of art or, film, TV. It's hard to be objective about it. Some things you love more than others. It's kind of like, it's hard to be objective about the flaws of your children. So if you really, really love a TV show or film or book, you'll find it much harder to nitpick. I kind of got two basic points. Is that, do nitpicks matter? Well, I think yes, if they take you out of the story, if they break your sense of disbelief, which I think you mentioned that, you were taken out of A Quiet Place a bit by the flaw that you spotted, and that's something that can happen with Doctor Who, is a good example, is that, like, I can be really on board with something Doctor Who based and, a Doctor Who story, and then, like, basically there's something that kind of just snaps me out of it.
It's weird as well, this might be a question for another time, in fact it almost definitely is, that almost all the science, air quotes, in Doctor Who is bollocks. So it's always interesting where the snapping point on your individual bollocksometer actually is.
That's why some people really can't stand Doctor Who at all. They just find it's too implausible.
Those people have particularly few bollocks. Or something.
And so I think if it takes out the story, then it is a valid nitpick. But also it depends on that for your personal area of expertise, what you know about. Like, for example, we were talking about China Miéville before. A friend of mine, when reading Pedulla Street Station, which is a sort of fantasy steampunk set thing. In that world, there's a lot of things powered by steam. And my friend who's volunteered on Preserved Railways and is very interested in steam trains and knows about steam, basically said that the inaccuracies about how steam technology works in the book just took him out of it completely. It was like, and he's like, degree to which I know this is something I nitpick on, like how steam engines work, but it just took him out of the story a bit. And for me, it's like, well, I know a little bit about how it works, but not a lot. So I was able to breeze through the idea of sort of steam-powered computers or what have you, because it for me, it's not something I know enough about to nitpick, but it varies from person to person. My dad's a historian, and he basically nitpicks historical dramas, especially historical dramas of his period. I've received emails from him after he's watched episodes of The Crown. He does mid-20th century history. Well, The Crown, or especially Darkest Hour, the Churchill film, is emails saying that, like, this is what's wrong with the film. Like, this didn't happen. This happened slightly differently. These are things you simplified. And obviously, because it's an area that he knows about. Most other people, it's just a film. They see it. If you know the topic, you'll nitpick more. So I guess there's two aspects to it. Yeah, there's one, if you know something better, or an area that's something you're maybe more likely to have a nitpick that takes you out of it. And B, the more you love something or the amount of goodwill you had to it, the less likely a nitpick is to take you out of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I argue with someone who doesn't like a thing you like, not just someone who has a nitpick and is a bit sort of about it, but someone who actively doesn't like it, is often so pointless. Like, someone could come up to me and say, I hated A Quiet Place because I thought the dialogue was a bit hammy and there was this nitpick. I mean, I don't care. I like the film and was invested. I'm not necessarily blind to those faults, but I still thought it was good. And then they can come back and go, what about those genuine things that weren't entirely great about it? And then the conversation just ends up being framed somehow like you're some sort of weird blind fanboy zombie, but that's how things work sometimes, This segment may end up turning into me moaning about the checklist nature of some internet arguments where human feeling is extracted and the point just comes down to, can you counter all my points? No, then you lose, which is annoying. In case it hasn't come across in this so far, I'm annoyed by that. So yeah, in short, sometimes in life, on the internet, people act like nitpicks actually matter. I do not think nitpicks actually matter that much, unless there are enough of them that it really just destroys the entire film, and I don't quite know what that critical mass would be. Like, I quite liked Captain America Civil War, as we previously discussed on this podcast, but I'm well aware you can nitpick it. I mean, specifically the baddie master plan that basically requires he can see the future in order to manipulate the activities of basically everyone. And, part of me, on some strange level, would quite like it if they, had the decency to make a film that didn't have that problem, so I could like it without needing to feel that mild edge of compromise, but they didn't. I still like it. Plus, that sort of stupid master plan is almost a staple of comics. I'm almost okay with them homaging it, but that's not the point.
It's about the emotional relationship you have with something, and that determines how much goodwill you have. One thing that I really dislike about nitpicking is that I don't like nitpicking for the sake of it. It's just trying to break things down. And I know there are definitely people out there, and obviously everyone's allowed to enjoy anything in exactly the way they want. I'm not trying to police other people's fun, but there are some people who the way they have fun out of something is basically I must break it down. I must stress test this film or TV show like by hitting every aspect of plot and character as much as possible and seeing where it breaks, with nitpicks. By that sort of process, the best TV show ever is the one that stands up to the most battering. Which fair enough, and like I say, I really am generally not trying to police other people's fun. And yeah, we do a pop culture analysis podcast, so we do like to...
I was about to touch on the hypocrisy, yes.
Yeah, but like, I'd like to think I don't take gleeful joy in breaking things down, that actually we try to use our hammers of nitpicks to kind of actually build things up. The sense of like, we're trying to celebrate things and add to the canon of pop culture knowledge, not basically smash things and turn everything into rubble and maybe salvage something from the rubble.
But I don't even mind a certain level of, nitpicking. I mean, I've been on comic book message boards, there's 50 years or whatever of continuity to shovel through and use as a hammer to hit the current stories with. And, I'm aware that on some level it's fun trying to make the canon click together or think about how things work or just go, I've spotted a thing. I think it's very specifically when it becomes really aggressive and really, this is why you suck, that I start to find it a bit punishing. Yeah, again, I'm not policing people being faddish and getting into the guts of things. I've done it myself. I'm just always cautious of acting like it matters that much.
And sometimes it's fun to nitpick things that you like. I mean, we talked about Doctor Who, and part of me does actually generally enjoy sort of seeing the kind of the holes in Doctor Who or things like that, and it comes from a place of love ultimately, in that Doctor Who is silly, but the kind of the silliness is part of the joy of it. And I wouldn't want Doctor Who to suddenly become like very, very I'm trying to think of a show that's very, very sort of like rigid in its approach to science. I wouldn't want Doctor Who to turn into Primer, whereas like the consequences of everything are thought out and explored in detail. You can't just kind of science something away or timey-wimey out of existence. The kind of the complexities and paradoxes of time travel become manifest. Doctor Who would not be fun like that. That is a different thing.
Getting aggressively angry about the inconsistencies in Doctor Who. I mean, the continuity in Doctor Who is as much bollocks as the science. They're clearly just going, well, look, it works this way in this story because it does. If that contradicts another story, then okay, cool, whatever. A lot of it is a certain degree of fairy tale logic. I know that's become more and more a thing in the current era as things get more vaguely magic and vaguely designed to hit the emotions, but I feel like at this point the continuity is bollocks.
I think it's always been there in Doctor Who to some degree. It's always been a bit of, it just does what it needs to do to tell the story that it's trying to tell.
I feel like you can overcome a lot of these nitpicks a lot more easily if it's plot rather than character, I sometimes find. I think people, I don't know, we shouldn't generalise, I go to my entertainment to be swept up by the characters to an extent. If a nitpick involves a character acting stupidly or weirdly or out of character for plot reasons, I find that's a lot more likely to break the spell and make me get iffy about something than if I can spot some inconsistency in the background or the storyline. Like, I'm sure there was some imperfect plot stuff too, but in Jessica Jones Season 2 recently, Trish, seeming like a different, slightly annoying character, bothered me about 6 times more than any of the fact that maybe that conspiracy didn't make sense. If the characters are still there and they're still the characters you like, then I think that helps you with your, getting invested and letting the tiny shit go.
I think, you've really hit the nail on the head there, that characters behaving out of character is much more of an issue than like, a plot not hanging together. I'm much more willing to accept, a good story that kind of a bit where like, well, that was a sort of bump in the road, but, pass it rather than like, characters start behaving like someone else that's just no plausible reason. That will break the spell.
Yeah, the bit we identified in The Quiet Place, a lot of that was just to get the characters to a certain place, which is probably the most I can say without spoiling it and being a dick. And and it worked because of our investment in the characters, and that's why I'm not that bothered by it.
Yeah. I think your points about goodwill is one, and I think it's possible for TV shows to lose goodwill and then you're much likely to poke holes in the plot. One example I was going to use, but I realise I use it all the time and people are probably sick of me talking about it now, is, Lost. That was a show where I had goodwill and lost the goodwill, and then the nitpicks became a real issue.
Yeah, that does come up a bit, yes. I think just, clearly that sort of era of 2000s TV was very formative for you.
And another one I think that where this happened was, which I don't think we talked about too much in the podcast, but I know it's a show we both have strong feelings about, is Dexter. In that even, let's say, the third series that was overall good but had flaws, I was much more willing to accept and not nitpick it because it was overall good. By the time we were into the dreadful sort of 7th and 8th series, the show had completely lost my goodwill and I was much more likely to nitpick it.
And a couple of the characters were acting phenomenally out of character. Which didn't help. There were some plot moves involving Dexter's adopted sister in the penultimate season, which in particular did go quite a long way towards breaking my will to keep watching the show and possibly even continue living. That was some pretty bad shit.
Your degree to nitpick is entirely based on how emotionally invested you are in something. or to the degree which you have knowledge of it. And just because you've got an emotional investment in something doesn't mean you can't lose it, and then the nitpicking flaws just become more present and more annoying.
Yeah, coming back to the metaphor earlier, yes, once you fall out of love with something, I guess, the flaws open themselves up before you, and it's just find yourself hard to ever get back to the place you were with that thing or person or meal in the first place. Not sure why I brought food into it, but anyway, it's all about not falling out of love.
Have you had breakfast yet?
I have had breakfast, yes. I'm on top of my food schedule, don't worry, it's fine. I was just desperately reaching for a comparison and going to a weird place with it.
Yeah. Sometimes, like I say, nitpick can be fun. Sometimes it's part of the way you celebrate the love for something, that you're good friends with someone when you have the same passion for the same TV show or film or whatever, and you can revel in the nitpicks and stuff. It's only hard for an outsider to see, but actually the criticising of something is actually an expression of joy and bonding and friendship. So that way nitpicks can really matter, but in a positive way.
Yep, that's a good positive note to end on. Care Bear hugs for everybody. Well done.
Well done.
Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like yet more, then you can get to us at moderatefantasyviolence.com, including a few blog posts, deleted scenes from older episodes, our, at this point, surprisingly vast backlog of episodes. And you can also, if you enjoy said backlog, review us on iTunes and tell us all your exciting nitpicks of our earlier episodes. As long as it's still a 5-star review, that's fine. That's fine.
You can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, and you can find us on Facebook, where we are Moderate Fantasy Violence. If you just search for that, our purple logo will pop up, and you can find us there. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm Alistair JR Ball, or just at Alistair JR Ball. You can also find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
Okay, and I am Nick MB on Twitter. That's M for Matthew, B for Brian. I hope I pronounced it clearly enough in all the previous episodes. And you can also find my website at nickbryan.com, which has now officially had its relaunch go live, which includes a nice free comics page showing all the comics I've posted lately, and should or will soon feature pre-orders for my upcoming 5th crime book. It's all going, the Nick Bryan Media Empire. And speaking of Media Empires, in our next episode, it's Avengers Infinity War, the culmination of the last 10,000 years of Marvel films. I am still quite excited and optimistic for this. Alistair possibly slightly less so. But nonetheless, we will be seeing it on opening day, and we will be here in 2 weeks to tell you what we thought. So we will see you then. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Bye. Resisted the urge to nitpick the question as well. What is a nitpick?
What is a nitpick, really? Are you talking about primary school children clutching at their own head?
Some of the time.
When? Almost none of the time. Fine.
I don't know. Maybe if you watch more children's TV.
Another thing you don't do.
No, another thing I don't do.